We'll just start. So we've read Agamben's text, Man and Animal. It's called The Open. And do you want to? So just tell me, what did you think of this text?
Well, I think it's like um, on its own, it. I think we need Heidegger in order to understand what's motivating it, because on its own, it's not that impressive. It's only if we think about it in terms of the general questions in philosophy, which is like the split between what's motivated the split between so-called analytic philosophy and continental philosophy, and what's motivated Heidegger. And Agamben has said his two masters are Heidegger and Walter Benjamin, and that the latter has allowed him to survive Heidegger. I don't have any particular interpretation of that statement, but just that in order to get to Agamben, to go through Heidegger
Yeah.
to some extent.
Okay, cool. So yeah, I suppose if I was to describe the text to someone who hadn't read it before, I'd probably say something like it's Agamben's specific use of understanding the change between how we understand ourselves, I suppose, ontologically, in distinction to animals, like man and animal, man being distinct from animal, how that has kind of met a crisis with the end of history. Um, that's at least that's the part of the text which really stuck out to me. It's kind of why I thought it would be good to do a conversation about it. And he incorporates a lot of Heidegger into this. He incorporates Bataille, um, a dialogue between Bataille and, I always say Kohevi, but I don't know if I'm saying his name right. Kojevi, Alexander Kojevi.
I know
Uh,
Michael Millerman said that too, but I just think it's wrong. I heard Leo Strauss say Kojev. I think it must be Kojev. I mean, Leo Strauss was
okay,
a close
okay,
personal friend of the.
okay. Well, as long as people
Not,
know,
I
like,
don't think he.
as long as people know who we're talking about.
I think they say that because the J in German is would be pronounced that way, but he's not a German, and
Uh-huh.
he's like a
Yeah.
Russian immigrant, but he spoke German.
Okay, okay. Okay, so yeah, Alexander Kojevi, the guy who was a kind of Hegelian. He wrote a lot about the end of history and so on. Fukuyama was deeply influ has
And
is
also, he played
deep
a.
influence.
I think it's important to interject that he played a role in real politics in France. He was a politician.
Yeah, I think he was kind of helpful in setting up the EU, basically. He was, he was like a high level diplomat. He kind of involved in the post-war reconstructing. Well, it was, I think I could be getting the timeline wrong, but it was kind of post-war reconstruction of
Yeah, I
Europe.
don't know. I'm not. I don't know the details that well either. But I know. Yeah, you're right. I think that's correct. In the
Okay, yeah.
EU. Yeah.
I Kojev is, yeah. I don't know how well read you are on him. I've read some of his text. His kind of main, I can't remember what it's called now. It's basically his interpretation of the slave master dialectic.
Yeah, I
And
read the big Hegel book, which supposedly he took a year to write, and which Jacques Derrida was attending his lectures at some near time.
okay,
You know,
cool.
like when Fukuyama came out with his book, Derrida said, "Oh, this is old hat. I already got this from Koja,
Mm.
in the University of Paris back in the day."
Yeah, yeah, cool. So yeah, so we're dealing with a lot of different influences on Agamben here. And I suppose, do you think it is that a fair summary of the text, that like he's looking at the crisis of the end of history through animal human ontology distinctions?
Well, say let me try to orient this towards it. It's like if you start with the way Leo Strauss does it, thinking of the beginning of political philosophy with Socrates, Plato, but saying that we don't really get any, shine a lamp or a flashlight to see the illuminate it unless we have also the Jerusalem and Athens, and then we get the notion that man is created by Hashem or by God in the Hebrew Bible, and then we get this the different notion of that speech is the most important trait of this particular animal called the human being in the Athenian tradition. And then a lot of things happen, and then enlightenment, and which, by the way, it's interesting to point out that like Galileo and Francis Bacon and Newton, it's all before the French Revolution. So they're in this like free time of everything seems kind of good and it's getting better. And then the time that we're dealing with is more like motivated by the time after the French Revolution, when how Zizek always says, you have the revolution, everybody's all excited, but what about the day after? What about the day after, the night before? So it's like we're in that period where we realize it wasn't all it was cracked up to be. And then in the 19th century, people start posing this question, like Dilthey, who motivates Heidegger, and Count Paul York Vardenberg pose this question. They say, like, we have like three major traditions telling us what we are: the Christian tradition, the biological tradition, and the philosophic tradition. And so they all give us different versions of what we are and what our relationship to the animals is.
Okay, good. Yeah, that's helpful. So yeah, so actually I'll go into the letters between Kojev and Bataille, because I thought that was a really interesting part of the text, which I'm definitely going to utilize in my own writings in the future. So it's like Bataille and Kojev sent letters to each other about the idea of the end of history. And basically, okay, I can't remember the exact details, but Bataille was reluctant to accept the end of history, what this means for human beings, human ontology. What are we? It seems like once the end of history happens, that we stop being philosophical creatures, certainly. Whether or not we stop being Christian, kind of spiritual creatures, possibly that too. We are reduced to this category of economics or biology or both. And and this is obviously relevant to Agamben, because he talks about bare life and so on. And um Kojev kind of says, well, no, like we will still have things which make us human, like practices, I suppose, like anthropological things, like play, art, literature, festivals, festivities. We have things which make us human that are unique, that are like unique to humans, that animals don't have. So we're not necessarily degrading to animality in some sort of barbaric sense, like we live in the woods and we fucking, hunter gatherers. We regress to hunter gatherers. We're going to be humans in a civilized sense, except the difference is all of this stuff like art and play and literature and so forth is stripped of its I think what Agamben described was it's stripped of its radical negativity and radical sacredness. So you're left with human, I suppose, anthropology, maybe, but it's not.
Well, so let me just interject that anthropology is the sort of ambivalent term, because Kant uses anthropology to mean the Platonic psychology, basically, or psychology, and it's only in very relatively recently that anthropology has come to mean what it currently means: the study of human beings as though human beings were primitive cultures. Because before, like, the most advanced state would be like in Lewis and Morgan or something, as Dugan brings out, there'd be like savages and barbarians, and then Kant calls them all in different things, like Wilde, or like wild men, and then there'd be the state which the Europeans are in, which would be the civilized state. Of course, then we also had that disparity between, like, Heidegger repeats in some of his lectures, like, we as Germans are supposed to be, guarding ourselves against this terrible thing, civilization, because that's the French thing, like, as you were bringing out in your reading of what's that book called?
The Civilizing Process, but Elias.
Yeah, the civilizing process. Yeah. And as Germans, we're supposed to be the guardians of culture. So there's that. So there's a bunch of ambiguity. What you're saying.
Yeah. Yeah. So the I suppose there's the end of history, and like people give a different date for the end of history. Obviously, some people say it's back in the 19th century. Some people say it's
The Battle of
1989.
Jena seems to be the most
Yeah.
like prevalent thing. The end of the Holy Roman Empire. I think it's Francis II abdicates,
Hmm.
and then the new
And
regime comes in.
that would
I
be
guess
what, like
Napoleon was still
1810 or something like that, I think. Ish.
something like that. I don't remember
Yeah.
the exact date. Yeah, Napoleon was still around at the time
Yeah, sure. I think Napoleon didn't die till like
for some time later.
1815 or 1820 or something like that. Okay, so yeah.
But the point is the end of the Holy Roman Empire.
Okay, yeah, yeah. So basically, like, you know, how whenever we date the end of history is obviously up for dispute. But what this process, we don't need to give it a specific date. This gradual process, which we could give anywhere from 1810 to 1989, it it changes it changes like what human ontology. It changes human life, human social reality in a radical way. And I think that is what Agamben seems to be pointing to here, in the sense that like if human life gradually becomes stripped from its radical negativity and its radical sacredness, like like we're not going to turn into animals in some obvious sense, but we kind of I think that even Agamben brings up, he could be quoting Kohevi here, but he says something like, humans will be happy, but humans, or they'll have meaning, but this won't be what it meant. This won't be what it once meant. This, like, the
Yeah, so
meaning of
like
that will change.
I
Yeah.
mean, if you go back to we could make a scale like from Socrates and Plato and Aristotle um, through um, on the point of um, autonomy and Kant. Um, it's rather complicated and a bit long-winded, but let me try to do it this way. So, like Leibniz said, and this is also, I think, a sound interpretation of that early episode of Nietzsche about the tightrope walker, which we discussed before. Leibniz said, natura non saltus facit. So natura, nature, non doesn't, saltus, literally somersault. And in the German and in the English word, it comes directly from the Latin saltus. And Nietzsche surely would have known that as a classical scholar. Facet, so it's usually translated as nature doesn't make leaps, right? So it's like more like natural. How do they say that in physics? The regularity of nature. So it's like physics couldn't work unless there's a regularity of nature. Nature doesn't make leaps, and then Nietzsche is saying, "Oh, but oh no, but it can make leaps because." Um, I mean, I could go more. I could try to make more remarks to give more to that, but just let's start with that. There's a radical question that has to do with the coming in of modern generalized science, which claims there's this regularity of nature, and nature doesn't make leaps. And basically, in our own time, analytic philosophy represents that as a kind of neo-positivism, a lapsed neo-positivism that doesn't really believe in itself. A.J. Ayer, for example, is a great core example of this kind of thinking. And so that the whole situation they're talking about has a lot to do with the rise of current experimental science.
Okay, yeah. And I mean, would that be because science gives us an understanding of ourselves and humans and human life and the world, which is, I suppose, stripped from its spirituality and its philosophy?
More behavioral, right? Like we look at more behavioral, more utilitarian. So, like in Aristotle, there's a guy who gives a really good account of this. Colin Cunningham, a theologian, of Aristotle's version of the theological virtues as read by think by the Catholic tradition. But basically, Aristotle thinks there's like you have to like make. He has a formula for you have to bring together the good, the true, and the beautiful. The agathon, the aletheia, and the kalon, which doesn't really mean kalon doesn't really mean beautiful. It means something more like or splendid or something like that. Aristotle, so like in the Nicomachean Ethics, Aristotle has originally said arte or virtue, but virtue is again, I have to make all these saving clauses because like virtue, when the way we hear it through like Victorian England or something. It sounds
Yeah.
like it has to do with the chastity of women or something. But arte originally, Cicero said, who studied like 300 years after those guys in Athens, he said what they meant by arte was what the Romans call fortitudo, which is like the chief virtue of the man. And I think we still have that usage
That
when we say,
is that like fortitude? English one?
yeah, fortitude, exactly. But understood as like, I don't know, like if a backpack is meant to carry something, this is like, it's supposed to be like, this is what a human being is supposed to be able to do.
Mm.
Arte. And actually the word virtue, like VIR, it literally means like a courageous warrior or something, like a man. That's
Yeah, I mean,
literally
like,
what virtue
yeah,
means.
is that exactly like
Virtus.
the Greeks and the Romans, particularly from the Greeks, their whole idea of like an ideal person is male. Like they don't have this sort of more androgynous modern understanding of like a good citizen or a virtuous person. It's very male, and um yeah, and I think the classical understanding of like human fulfillment or human happiness is more like a kind of teleological process where some sort of human nature is perfected, but it's kind of actualized through social practice and through self-cultivation and so forth. Whereas, um, yeah, like I suppose our modern understanding of human fulfillment is that doesn't really have that sort of that sort of harmony between what we're determined to be by nature and what we is kind of undetermined by like convention, right? There's a kind of
Well, I mean, you still see it as late as in Rousseau, but Rousseau is contrasted with the Lockean version, which is like just like freedom to choose. But like Rousseau thinks like the breaking out of the instincts and bringing in reason is still in play. So it's like, but we've lost that language because it's there's a book called like From the Passions to the Emotions that shows that like passions is everything we call heteronomous, attacking us from outside, and the true human action is only the thing that's freed up from that. But so like Aristotle and the Nicomachean Ethics is saying what arte is the habit of choosing correctly. So I think in if you leap all the way to modernity, the habit of choosing correctly is really what Kant is meaning by the goodwill, by willing, and then Nietzsche takes that over.
okay. Um, where are we going to go next with this? Um, maybe we should jump into Heidegger then, because we talked about. Oh no, sorry. Yeah, last thing I wanted to mention before we go to Heidegger is Bataille's um notion of what's it unemployed negativity. Okay, so this is I thought this was really important. I think it's really good because like I'm very much trying to think through myself like the end of history as we kind of know it today in this sense of like 1989 Fukuyama world, right? So um Bataille has this brilliant term called unemployed negativity. So he's talking to Kojev, and he's saying, okay, but like, what about the philosophers? What about the people that have this radical negativity? What this radical sacredness? What about the kind of that historical quote unquote element in society? Like, is that just going to vanish? And Kojev's answer is basically like, no, but it's just going to be a kind of unemployed negativity, rather than in history, it's more like an employed negativity, right? Um, um, so it's like, well, does the kind of historical spirit of man just die? It's like this, it doesn't die. It just goes out of work, if that makes sense. And I thought that was a really good framing for it because it's true. Like it can't die because we're still human, right? Like we'd have to undergo some
Well,
sort of
are we? Because if we go strictly by the physics interpretation, we're something much radically lower than a human being. We're just a movement of matter, right? And not even that, because it's just the mathematical ability to use math to then make predictions about the future through thinking about the movement of very small particles. Which is, in other words, a human being, it's like you go to organs, like the organs of the body is much higher level. They use the terms of course, of emergence, like in physics, in order to cover this up because they don't know how to handle it. And then up above the organic body, there's the human being ourselves, right? So, but but in the tradition, it was understood that the human is the highest thing, and still that's why Kant is saying the goodwill is the highest thing. So it's like there's an ordering, there's an understanding of higher and lower.
okay, so there's a kind of
A stone is lower.
it's a hierarchical ordering going on. But okay, so like okay, so what I meant to say we're still human is simply in the sense to say biologically we're kind of the same thing, animal on a purely biological level that we were like 300 years ago, right? Um, uh, and in that sense, the capacity, the potentiality for like historical subjectivity, right, is like it must, in a sense, you would presume, in a sense, that it would still be here
Well,
within
let's say
people
more or
today.
less, because we're being selectively bred by the so-called institutional arrangements, right?
Okay, yeah, fair. So, so yeah,
I mean, evolution
there
doesn't
is,
stop, right? It's continuous.
yeah, there is a eugenicist sort of slant to this as well. You could say there's a kind of liberal eugenicism or kind of end of history eugenicism, where it's like we are being
Right.
bred out of our radical negativity. But I would say, because purely by the fact that we're having this conversation now, we're doing a kind of philosophical reflection of human existence in this radical sense, which you weren't supposed to have, because Kojev says at the end of history, philosophy dies. Um, there must be something there. There must be something there. I see signs of that coming back a little bit today. There seems to be something. Um, if you think of it not being employed, what does that mean? To me, that's sounded like, for example, Sloterdijk wrote this book called Rage and Time probably like a decade or two ago, and he said
Yeah,
that like
Zornen's like, yeah, right.
yeah, and it's quite good. Like, and he says like the end of history could be defined by the fact that there's no more there's no more political or social mechanisms for basically wielding mass, you could say negativity, mass anger, mass discontent towards creative new historical political goals. Like the kind it's not
And somehow
necessarily
within the horizon, that's extreme cynicism and extreme seriousness have folded into the same thing, and you can't distinguish them. Like
well
Zizek,
that
for instance.
yeah, like that kind of goes into his work of critique of cynical reason as well. Like because Sloterdijk would retain in him like this kind of ambition, this kind of that some sort of new horizons could be met. But he basically says that like the mass discontent of our modern societies isn't isn't for some strange reason, which he doesn't really explain, but it seems to be the case, that isn't capable of wielding that into a new horizon, which history proper was able to do. So you have this incapacity. So you still have that anger, that discontent. You have it in many different forms. You can think of terrorism, like Islamic terrorism. You can think of like Trump, even to some extent. He's kind of a expression of this kind of belligerent, anti-political correct, kind of anti-technocratic kind of um mass feeling. So you still have kind of emotional energies out there which are present, which are not like these self-satisfied liberal
Well, I
energies,
mean, I think
but
the
there's no.
thing is, from the philosophic point of view, or which the end of history is posited, it's like what's in play there is kind of like, for instance, if is there really evolution and de-evolution such that evolution names the going up? And then apply the same thing to politics. Say you have this tension between the current laws on the books and the force behind those laws, which Kant was thinking of. And Kant makes the solution according to what Friedrich de Grosse said, is that you can argue, but you must obey. So there's current laws on the books, but now we're opening up liberalism where you're allowed to argue, but you still have to obey a force and authority, well, the police force. But then the question is whether the people proposing a change in the current laws are actually proposing real progress. That whether the progressives, whether the Gladwell in saying like I'm for less child labor was actually progressing over what's the other guy, the enemy of Gladwell? I forget that. The other guy was saying, no, we have to have still children chained to the coal wagons or whatever. So, I mean, the idea that there's in some ways it seems like the changes in the laws have actually been an evolution or a progress, and then Kant is thinking like there'll eventually be an end to that. But if we're already at the end of history, then that whole progressive conservative thing, it doesn't really make sense. It's like it's supposedly the basic framework is already in, and the rest is just an arbitrary bickering which hasn't settled into that formal, inhuman, basic all men are equal by virtue of our humanity. We all have equal rights, and for instance, the right to our bodily integrity or something. And that the main things are settled, but then there's still just this noisy remainder.
Okay, yeah. So there's this noisy remainder, like, yeah, 'cause that kind of reminds me of like Zizek would talk about things which would happen in parts of the world where it seems like historical events, but he'd say you could divide these historical events into, catch up modernizing things where these noisy remainders are being settled, basically, where basically like the main paradigm of liberalism, global liberalism is settled, but you have some contention in Egypt over women's rights or something, right? Like these are presented to us as these great historical moments, blah, 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 but they're actually just these noisy remainders being settled. And um then you have the question of, okay, so like, are there any like events which really go against the kind of fundamental liberal paradigm? And I suppose that's the kind of Duginist
Second, wait, let me
position.
just say, I
Yeah.
was just thought of something is Heidegger gives the example of in the around 1929, he gives the example of saying our Dasein is so atrophied. We're so little think that we have to summon our strength as a Dasein, like our Tyler Durden strength, rather than the Edward Norton Das Man
Yeah.
side. He thinks we're so inert to that we didn't even notice really World War One. It's like it came, it passed. Okay, back to business as usual. It wasn't even an event.
Yeah, exactly. Okay. So like Heidegger's noticing this character of the last man going back much, much further than like, past 30 years. Um, so yeah, it's like, okay, so the question I was saying earlier, is there events that are challenging the liberal paradigm proper? Is there anything going on? I don't know, this is a question
Well,
to you. Like, I don't know. Do
I
you think
think
is
the
it there?
event is really to be discovered in the awakening of seeing that just as we have progressivism and conservatism in politics, we have behind that um, analytic philosophy and continental philosophy, which are the main intellectual authorities today. And it's just as it's an uneven fight between the progressives who have been in power since the French Revolution or the American Revolution, basically. And I was thinking of Disraeli, by the way. Disraeli was like for more strict, letting the children be workers in the coal mines and factories and whatever, and Gladwell was against that. But that's just an example of how there's been a movement in a certain way in the Steven Pinker sense, but it's like it's become more and more arbitrary to where it's being pushed in funny directions. And the same thing with analytic philosophy. Originally, analytic philosophy had a solid thesis at its core that everything should be observed, that every statement of scientific fact should be observable. The Moritz Schlick, a German in Vienna, said that, and then A.J. Ayer brought it back to England. But then they all, after a while, they all ceased to really believe that, and then Wittgenstein comes in and things like that. But it's still in, and I mean, notice that the phrase analytic philosophy has a substantive content. That's the one in power. And then, as you brought out, as Schmidt mentions in that Land and Sea book, after the war, continental became like a pejorative, right? So one names a geographical feature, and the other names the actual philosophic content, analytic propositions.
Yeah.
And those are the two powers that are in control right now. So what Agamben and Heidegger are trying to do is show, as it were, like Aristotle says, we learn how to do some things by doing them and for the sake of doing them. He wants to show a philosophy that we could awaken or learn that's outside of that, but which preliminarily right now we're in a phase where people just pass off Heidegger as subjective or continental in opposition to analytic. But Heidegger himself and Agamben think of themselves as overcoming that.
Overcoming that paradigm of continental analytical, you mean?
Those
Like
two intellectual authorities, which mark the like the Glasnost are opening in our self-understanding of what we are.
okay. So like
Analytic philosophy is really the handmaiden of the sciences.
yeah. So like similar to a kind of post-left right paradigm where we don't think everyone is being left or right. It would be similar to that, like post-continental
Like
analytical
Dugin,
paradigm.
maybe, yeah.
Okay,
Although people
yeah.
think of Dugin as right.
Okay, yeah. And what would be the character of this post-continental analytical divide? Like what would be the kind
So,
of
like for
defining feature?
example, one of the major things that's at issue, um, yeah, you mentioned the thing about why is the animal considered to be poor in world in Heidegger. So that
Yeah.
has to do with Heidegger's using this word Weltarmut. So Armut means it's used to mean poverty by economists, but the word itself, mut, means courage. So it's similar to like arete or virtue or all those type of words. And it's used in a wide variety of like the whole like the classicists use the idea of semantic field. So Heidegger does some semantic field looking at different forms of that word, and he doesn't just use Weltarmut, but like it's too much in the close fine details to go into it. But just to give some idea of the semantic field of that, Zonagist Gemut is sunny disposition. Schmermut, melancholy. And then I wanted to just give a quote to indicate what the opposite of being. So, I mean, he organizes that in the notion that the stone has no world, animal is Weltgemut, or deprived of world in some sense, and human being is world forming. But what does it mean to be world forming? One statement that kind of, I think, points a little bit towards what he thinks of as world forming is from Kant, from his critique of practical reason. Two things fill the mind with ever new and increasing admiration and awe, the more one reflects over them, the starry heavens above me and the moral law within me. Zwei Dinge erfüllen das Gemüt, mit immer ... So he uses, so you would think of the phrase two things fill the mind, that we might have Geist or a word like that, but he actually says Gemüt. Gemüt could mean heart, could mean mind, it could mean sort of just like and also the common phrase gemütlich, like Germans use that, it's like
Happy, right? Like Gamut?
Yeah,
No,
it's like
no.
a cozy, happy, relaxed. You're off
Oh yeah,
work. You're
yeah,
letting.
cozy. Yeah, yeah. I was thinking like a Glücklich
Um,
is happy. Yeah, so gemütlich.
and there's kind of parallels in some Scandinavian languages for that. And I think of like Germans think of like coffee and cake is Gemüt, whereas like maybe in more in America we would think like a cocktail party would be more the equivalent. Germans refer like coffee and cake to that. They think it's more a relaxed situation. But
Like content.
yeah.
Exactly.
Um, but the specific way they want to approach, so that's like an emotion, right? We would call that an emotion, and we'd try to say what's happening in that. We'd try to get some guy like Sam Harris to tell us, oh, what's happening in the brain when this emotion is going on or whatever. But what Heidegger is saying is he wants to try to show that this is actually a primary phenomenon, and it's not something we can point to like a neuron or like a stone, but it's a primary feature of reality. And then the debate point from the point of view of analytic philosophy is that they've interpreted, I don't think it's Descartes would recognize this as Cartesianism, but analytic philosophy has interpreted um, Descartes to mean that like say we're asking the question, how does language originally get its sense, and then we're talking about, say, look at this person, he's unhappy, he's in pain, let's say, and then it's like there's this question like somebody has the way they think of it is like first and third person or something like that, and then it's like oh, I have the feeling of pain, and then somebody, say a parent, says to me, oh, it looks like that was very painful, and then we also use it of other people who appear to be in pain. And then the idea is there's this notion that we're either inferring, so there's this step of like we see something and then we infer that there's a state of pain going on, or we're empathizing. And actually, it's interesting that the word empathy, if you look at the word frequency, it's like only after 1940 is the word empathy starts to be used a lot. I think before that, people would have um, they would have spoke of affinity or something, or of a sympathy maybe, or something like that, but not empathy seems to be like this notion of like projecting inside the other person, and it's connected to this kind of neo interpretation of what it's totally wrong, but it's what way they understand what Descartes was talking about as this split. And then there's this question of this split between the inner man and his uh, qualia or whatever, and the hidden realm. And then they realize, oh, we can't really go with strict analytic propositions because there are some things that don't show up to the sense data. There's some things where you can't say, is the cat on the table or not on the table, and then say the statement is true or false, because they go beyond the realm of strictly um, sense data propositions. And then everything starts to break down. And so in that space, it's like Heidegger kind of comes in, and that's one of his like paths up the Mount Everest. But there's, we go up Mount Everest a little way, Dred and Hillary or something, and then we realize we're not yet fit to do it. We come back down, we try again. So learning Heidegger is like that, is what I see. And the same with learning Agamben. They're trying to see a totally new way of thinking, which then from our current horizon, we could call a different intellectual authority beside from, well, once upon a time, there was a Catholic intellectual authority, but today we have analytic and continental intellectual authority, just as in China, once upon a time, there was Buddhism was coming in from India, was intellectual authority about the 4th century or so. And then later, there was a resurgence of the literati scholar authority. There's these changes. From that perspective, it would be just a change in intellectual authority.
Okay, and like, what did these intellectual? Kind of sounds like a naive question, but what did these what did these intellectual authorities fundamentally do? Like, what's their fundamental job? Is it they provide a kind of way of seeing ourselves?
I feel like what see like we're talking to each other, but I also want to talk to the conversation. So like
Uh,
we could say things that are very simple and also boring to a lot of people, but since if the conversation can hold everything, then it should hold also the simplest things too, right? So that it doesn't matter if the questions are too, I mean, if what we're raising is too dumb or too simple, right? But Yeah, what is I mean, I feel like I get some light on that by just thinking about it in a foreign situation like China. But I think about the Buddhists came in, and then the whole of the way people understand themselves, the way they think. Think of India, for instance. In India, still today, uh, the old epic, which was the Mahabharata, is still in power to where in ancient Greece, Iliad and Odyssey, before they were written down by Pisistratus around 600, people would do politics that way. So, like in India, like Modi's party would, in the countryside, have people dressed up as people from the characters from the Mahabharata and go in the village. And this is how they understood who they were supporting in politics. And this is how they understand life. And they have different ideas like Dhyana and karma. And it's just a totally different way of understanding their existence. So likewise, we would have taken from that perspective, that's how it would be. But I think taken from the when we talk about this Nietzschean saltus or somersault, in a way, what they want to say is it would be it's inconceivable because we would be no longer Edward Norton, we would be Tyler Durden, and it's impossible to. We act as though touches on the question of the animal. We act as though we could empathize with the bat or whatever, like the famous what's it like to be a bat? But we can't even do that with other human beings in India or whatever. So in a way,
Okay.
it's something inconceivable.
Okay. So, so I suppose we have these frames of understanding ourselves, which kind of have come to predominate over modernity. And I suppose a few of them that would come to mind would be like Homo economicus. Then you have a kind of scientific understanding of man is like this, obviously over time this gets more and more reductive or more and more materialistic, more positivistic. Um, Humans as a kind of rational animal, humans as
Yeah, except that rational is also like an ambivalent term.
yeah, of
Does
course, yeah.
rational mean calculating, or does it mean genuinely knowing the good in the Aristotelian sense of this organization of the good, the true, and the beautiful in our choices?
And does like, I suppose the kind of zoological component to Agamben, which I quite like to think about. This is this is like, is this a product of all these previous frameworks of self-understanding that we eventually just kind of condition ourselves into understanding ourselves as like these kind of zoo animals or something? Like we don't say it. We don't say I'm a zoo animal, but like uh, we sort of lose the mechanisms of understanding ourselves, which made us human, right?
Well, I think
So,
that's one of the big problems Kant is trying to deal with. The point of autonomy is that instead of autonomy is supposed to be the only thing that isn't sort of driven by the past in a way,
mhm.
like all these deterministic features. It's open, it's free. It's not open in the same way that Dasein is interpreted by. Like by the way, Agamben interprets Dasein as simply an opening, whereas he says Deleuze and Guattari and Foucault still understand a subject which is affected by the state and by the ideological state apparatus and all this kind of stuff.
Yeah. So in that sense, what Dasein means then, at least the way Agamben's using it, is it's an opening for a new self-understanding. Would that be fair?
I mean, not no. It's really that he wants to say. So, like Heidegger's basic contention is that the Greeks had a specific interpretation of being, where being just means, like still in Descartes, there's a four-part series of like two things prior to language and two things after language. Like in the divided line is one version of it, but it's like supposedly like we could just see something like just like an animal can just see something, like like I see a deer or something, and then at the same time, and that's happens without language intervening, and that's just being. And then I assure myself in some way without doesn't require language, but I assure myself that it's really there. The object is really there before me. And then there's two other levels on top of that where we're saying, oh, now I have the knowledge and now I'm an ego with the knowledge. And Descartes flips it around and starts on the highest level. And he's kind of subtly introduced this scheme where we always start from this level, this notion of consciousness and the ego. But what Heidegger contends is that already there was like a suppressed presupposition in that what being means is availability. And then they're challenging, they're saying, since now for the first time we're able to do like a Socratic challenge of being itself, which is unlike any other thing we could challenge, unlike justice, unlike anything. We're in this, we're on a new footing, and that's what they're calling the opening. And it's also specifically set against the subject-object understanding of things, where it's always, which is a confused concept in its own right. But I tried to touch on the way they understand that in terms of like projecting into people, trying to empathize to understand the inner world of somebody or something. But actually, the whole analysis from the beginning of the tradition is doesn't consider that at all, because it just, you know, if I'm first, it's actually first person, second person, third person are exactly the same thing. It's like I could say, you are having these thoughts. He was having these thoughts. I am having these thoughts. It's exactly the same thing. It's total. It's not like inner outer.
Okay.
That's a little bit confusing, but I'm trying to like just show the general subject matter that's involved.
Okay, good. Yeah. Yeah, yeah. It's always the Heideggerian stuff that kind of confuses me a little bit. And I think a lot of people that read this stuff, it's the same thing. It's the same thing with Sloterdijk as well. It's like his work makes a lot of sense to me, and as soon as it gets to the Heidegger parts, I start to get a little bit confused. But um, anyway, I have to read
Well,
more
I think it's
Heidegger.
just like Aristotle said. There's some things you have to learn, that like a carpenter or something. You have to learn the trade by doing it, and then you do it for the sake of doing it. And it takes many, you know, attempts to learn it.
Yeah.
And one way to attempt to get Heidegger is to go through some analytic proposition, the analytic route, and try to find some things in analytic philosophy which directly touch on Heidegger's thinking, because analytic philosophy is the dominant one and we're used to it and it makes sense to us already.
Mhm. Okay, cool. Yeah, there's a text which John David Ebert, he recommends if you want to understand Heidegger, it's like I think it's like lectures about being in time. So it's like being in time, the subject matter of being in time, but it's done in a more comprehensible way. And I think it's called, oh, I can't remember what it's called, but I have it saved on my Amazon list. I need to buy a copy, but it's something that's a bit more digestible. So that's, yeah, something I have to do. But
Well, Leo
um
Strauss made this remark that there's like, say you split things up between like French cafe discussion, which is like his way of saying like for the general public, and then
yeah.
theoretical discussion. He said the book by Barrett, William Barrett, The Irrational Man, which came out in the 50s, he said that's like a good thing for the general public reader. And I think Strauss is like a strong authority on Heidegger. But if you listen to Strauss, it takes many years and it's very complicated because he wants to go through all these theoretical ideas. But he himself points to that book. And then also after Strauss died, I think Barrett did a conversation with William McGee, which is quite good.
Okay, cool.
Although, but again, it's kind of super. I feel like those things are superficial and they're sort of just like something you could say in a cafe.
Mhm.
You don't get to the actual points. It's like Heidegger wrote like more than 100 books. Dugin read all of them, and it takes a long time to kind of learn how to move in that. And the point isn't to learn Heidegger, because Heidegger says like Heidegger talks about himself in the third person, like uh, like a who was it, Gadamer said to Heidegger, you have some problems with your etymology here, and Heidegger said, you mean Heidegger is wrong? Heidegger is wrong about that, and Gadamer said yes. And it's like, but Heidegger understands Heidegger as a rubric over something which people could learn and then independently um, treat as a skill and its as something in its own right. But it wouldn't be just a proficiency like some academic field is a proficiency, but it would be the complete thing. I mean, just like the thing, I think the Fight Club is kind of is good. I think Fight Club is relatively better than a lot of just like simple public discussions on Heidegger, which are too superficial. At least Fight Club kind of gives you the sense that the total thing is at stake. Like you
Yeah, well,
remember, like he has the moment where he's like, he realizes that he's actually Tyler Durden. It's like it's the
yeah,
total break
yeah.
because like
Well,
we're
like,
both Dawson and we're the other side, and the thing trying to face up to our Dawson.
yeah.
I mean, everyone themselves. So
The way I've written something about Heidegger recently, not Heidegger, Fight Club recently, and I put it as like that I framed it within his end of history, unemployed negativity sort of framing, and I said, so for example, in Fight Club, you have Edward Norton, and he's just like a normal guy. He's like a last man. He's like, whatever, just doing his job. He's just he's going by his life, not particularly thoughtfully, and he's blah blah blah. And
and I'd never read the book, but apparently he doesn't even have a name in the book. He's just the narrator. Or...
yeah, he doesn't have a name in the book, and he doesn't even have a name in the film. He's just basically called. Is he have a name in the film? I don't know.
The thing,
I
the
remember.
blurb I read said he's just known as the narrator. I don't know if they're just tagging on that he's just the narrator. I guess I don't know.
He's just. But the funny
I
thing
don't
is, like,
remember him having a name in the film either. I haven't read the
that's
book, but I just saw that in the film. I don't remember.
that's the interesting thing about the film is that like you're kind of introduced to this guy and you're following him around and he's going about his life and blah 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 blah, and then you're like, no one refers to him by his name and you don't really pick up on that.
Right.
Like it's just like it's
Well,
like
but
him. It's
he does have like name tags
it's
on, I guess, but I guess they're assumed to be like false names when he's at those self help things.
exactly. He uses a fake name. He goes to self-help meetings, and like it's funny because like you're three-quarters into the film, and if you asked someone who's watched the film for the first time, if you pause it and go, "What's his name?" They go, "What do you mean? What's his name? That's I don't know."
Yeah, I never even thought of that until I did a Google search because I wanted to talk about it today, and
Yeah,
like it says like he's just the unnamed narrator.
yeah. But like the way I sometimes think about it is like, so you have this guy, right? End of history, typical last man, and the unemployed negativity aspect is Tyler Durden, basically, right? That's Tyler Durden. It's this part of him, it's kind of potentiality, which doesn't really have a place within, you could say within society, you could say sociologically. We were kind of talking kind of sociologically earlier. We were saying, oh, like rage in time, there's no kind of political mechanism for wielding mass discontent to a new political party.
It's
It's kind of
Heidegger represents sometimes Dossman as the kind of place where you could hide. It's like a turtle shell or something terrible.
okay. Well,
It's like
like
when you get in Dossman mode, you're yeah, you can't be singled out or whatever. Be attacked
okay.
by the
Well,
cave, I guess.
what I was going to say was that like, but if you think about it, not just like sociologically, but if you think about it like within the level of, the being, or I suppose you could also
Existentially, right?
the kind of the existential reality of a person, right? That Tyler Durden is, he's unemployed negativity, but because he's unemployed, narrator Edward Norton doesn't even know he exists until he's like 30. And then all of a sudden,
Yeah.
he's like, even in the start of the film, he's kind of flashing the director puts there's just flash frames of Brad Pitt just in random scenes. So he's coming into your, he's kind of up in the Freudian term, coming up from the unconscious, kind of like he's coming in, and then all of a sudden he's taking over, and you've got this unemployed kind of force power within you, and you don't know what to do with it. and it's really disruptive, and then there's kind of a battle
It's
between
kind of like Heidegger is saying, like,
physicists.
this is what I, Heidegger, am doing is what everyone would be doing if they knew about it, but most people are in that uh, mindset that you're describing, that they're kind of doing it already, but they don't know about it. But that
Exactly.
whereas
Yeah.
Heidegger's doing it deliberately
And then
is his point.
because he doesn't know that he is Tyler Durden means that he doesn't even realize that like that thing that Tyler Durden represents is in himself. Like he doesn't know, that 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 negativity is is within him. It doesn't have a place within his own sense of self. So he has to kind of come up with an external person, with kind of psychological explanation of it. He has to come up with an external representation of that um uh, of that part, which is clearly of himself already. So, it's interesting because it does show you the coming to be of a kind of consciousness which realizes this negativity, which is this kind of radical negativity, we could say, which or unemployed negativity, which is in him. Because it's unemployed, it's so foreign and alien to him that he doesn't even know it's there. And he doesn't know that it's him as well until the end of the fuck and the
I
end.
think there's also like I tried to think about the unemployed negativity and I couldn't quite get to it, but I couldn't quite hone in on it. But there's also a way that Agamben is I think thematizing that in his he has some lectures on art where he gives like the example of I don't think some Canadian musician, I can't remember, but he also gives a nice example of Kafka of Josephine the singer. And I'm not exactly sure how to. My problem is I'm not exactly sure how to fit it in, but I think it's related. Is like it's related to the Heidegger places dunamis and energia in very close with being, so such that people like there's like a New York Times thing on Heidegger where they said, "Oh, Heidegger is the philosopher of possibility or something," which has some like bare sense in the text, but it's not really what Heidegger means. But Heidegger um, claims that ousia are being in Aristotle. Aristotle has not, in one version of the metaphysics, he doesn't, or in one book of it, he doesn't put, he puts dunamis and energia not with like the categories or somewhere else, but in this strange mix with being itself, but then motivates kind of his reading of this being as time. But the Agamben quotes Kafka to say Josephine the singer is said to be a great singer by the people, but only then she admits that I never really knew how to sing and I don't know how to sing. And it's like she had this potential, but it wasn't. I don't really know what to do with that, but I feel like that has to do with the unemployed negativity and like uh, there's a bunch of things I haven't sort of mastered in Agamben's take on that, but I think that's a relevant subject those things that Agamben
Well,
is
yeah, because
talking about.
I was gonna bring up potentiality because I think in again, to use the Fight Club example, like Tyler Durden, he is a kind of potentiality. He's like an untapped potentiality. Um, he kind of represents that. So, um,
And it's sort of an inchoate potentiality. It's not like a potentiality to tie your shoelaces or something known. It's like a
exactly, an unknown.
potentiality
Yeah,
for
yeah,
something
exactly.
that doesn't even exist in a way.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. It's not the potentiality to get a goal that you've already conceived of, and that you already want. Like, for example, if you're a last man, oh, I want to buy a house, I want to buy a car, I want to,
Right, right.
and blah blah blah. I want these things which are just assumed goods within your immediate sort of existence, right? It's 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 things which are outside of that framework, or even very antagonistic to that framework, and it's a kind of
Well, I
uh,
get the feeling that the author of Fight Club was aware of that theme, that part of it. Yeah.
Yeah, I think so too. I'm not sure how philosophically versed Chuck Palahniuk is, but if he's not, he's definitely like intuitively extremely
Yeah, just
philosophically.
like the general sense of yeah.
Yeah. Um, because that unexplored potentiality really is important in the film too, because there is this sense of like, well, what have I done with my life? Like what am I? Where am I going? And then like, that can be dealt with. I've written about this recently. I wrote that essay, self-improvement, for Space Monkeys, which is based off the reference from Fight Club where he says you're all space monkeys getting shipped off into space. But so you have like different versions of self-improvement. One version would be I want things which are immediately good which are kind of shown to me as being obvious goods within my kind of social moral existence. So I want more
Or
money.
even as, yeah, necessary, like, yeah.
It's not even like material necessities. It would be
Well, these are the things you're supposed to do. You're supposed to
yeah,
get a job, get placed in society, et cetera, et cetera. These are the
yeah,
necessary things for everyone to go.
exactly. And then you see the things which like if you the unknown things outside of that. And I think part of the problem is in the modern world is because we want things, we have an understanding of potentiality, which is like we want more of things which we've already been told or have believe are good, or less things which we are have been told or believe are bad. And I think there's a lack of self-reflection. So as Socrates points out in, I think it's Alcibiades, he says, if you want to improve a shoe, you have to know what a shoe is. And and that's obvious because we all know what a shoe is. But he says, if you want to improve a man, you have to know, inquire into what a man is. And that's less obvious because that is a kind of
Right, right.
philosophical question. So, so it's like when we
And
are,
also whether man is a stable thing. Like that's just the question between Aristotle and the Megarians. Like Aristotle says these potentials are stable things and they exist, and the Megarians say this everything's
in
uh,
flux, right?
we can't say that there's a stable potential.
Okay, yeah. So like you can even incorporate that into the inquiry and say, well, there is no stable thing called man. But even to get to that point, you have to go, okay, well, if we're going to improve something, we have to ask what it is. So like all of these modern kind of desires for more money or more status or whatever, these are all things which lack that inquiry into what we are. So I think when you have potentiality and you have inquiry, then you have the Tyler Durden thing. Then you have the kind of negativity
A
potentiality
tension between the, yeah, the two
coming out. Yeah.
two
And I think
poles. Yeah.
and like if I was to give like a kind of could history start again kind of question, whatever history means, blah blah blah. It would be something like that. It would be like, well, if a large enough amount of people can sort of incorporate a new horizon of potentiality, which also incorporates this inquiry, which thinks about what is outside of their presupposed framework, then maybe you would have history. If you just have like, so like for example, there's this question of like, you have a unipolar order and then you have a multipolar order. If Russia and China, for example, just want to replace the US as this kind of, more dominant, or challenge, not even replace, but challenge them, but like on the US's terms, if you get me, like challenge them without the inquiry, then is that really history or is that just geopolitics?
Yeah,
Right?
I mean, I guess like yeah, so like Dugin was appointed not that long ago to the head of the Ivan Ilyin Institute or University in Moscow, and I think is what he's taxed with is um, uh, evacuating the liberal United States, the global liberal intellectual authority from the Russian education system, so that like in 20 or 30 years time, just as it happened the reverse way in Ukraine, that the education system was changed. And I have like a good article about that by a guy called Katsaruba, like a Ukrainian that lives that's in a Canadian university, wrote an article about how that happened in Ukraine. This says the education in Ukraine made Ukrainians into Westerners. Dugin wants to make Russians like inoculate them against the Western thing.
Yeah, okay,
Or
yeah,
I mean,
makes
state
sense.
it negatively.
So
I mean,
that's
positively, he
like,
wants to make them Russian,
yeah,
autonomous
yeah.
Russian.
But I suppose okay, so well, there's two things to say about that. One is Dugan's a good example of an unemployed negativity, and then he's getting employed again because he wasn't employed in Moscow University for a while, right? Because he was talking about he got fired for some reason, and then he's been re-employed because of the war, I suppose, right? So,
I think it's because like Putin has accept. Well, see, there's an article that goes way back in the Eflux magazine, which is meant to be denouncing Dugin because they're like deep progressive radical leftists. And it says like Dugin was making some remarks, and basically Dugin said something along the lines, "Why should the world? What's the point of the world existing if Russia no longer exists?" And that Putin accepted that. And so that's why he's willing to risk nuclear war over this. And so it taken that way, Putin has been under the he's far from what Zizek says that Putin is just one, like of the people that one tool in Putin's toolbox. Taken that way, Putin has all the time been thinking in that direction.
so I suppose Russia now has the task though of like, sorry if there's background noise, people are walking across the window. Um, uh, there's, um, sorry, Russia now has the task of, so it's trying to inoculate itself against this kind of liberal Western hegemony. But I suppose the question is,
Or to
will
unlock
this,
its DOS sign, which would be like unlocking
yeah,
its Tyler Durden situation in a way. Because
yeah,
actually,
so
Heidegger even says that. I don't know why Dugin doesn't want to admit this, but Heidegger even says in his book History of Being, where being is spelled with a Y, he says we have to let the Russian DOS sign, like unlock itself and be itself. He
yeah,
says
so
that explicitly.
we're talking about like an unlocking process. So I brought up the last time,
Or face
Mark.
up to it. I don't know what you're right. I say
Yeah.
unlock because like the title of the Agamben book, Open, is sort of I think it means more like unlock than it means just like open space or something.
Yeah, and like this is exact. I like the word unlock because it's kind of got it's active, because to unlock something you have to kind of figure it out, but it's kind of
Yeah.
passive at the same time because it's letting something out. You're not like just we're gonna make this thing that we've already presumed is good. So for example, the last time we were talking, I brought up Margaret Thatcher, trying to remake Britain,
The
back to the
Adam Curtis
empire.
thing, yeah.
Yeah, the Adam Curtis documentary, really good documentary, and it's like but like that's exactly the opposite. It's like they're trying to recreate a kind of an
I feel like
English,
Trump is a lot like that.
exactly, yeah, yeah. They're trying to create this like in Margaret Thatcher's case, like this English. It's not design, but it's like English subjectivity, identity, um, which is just
Or
based
it's like
off of
with Trump's case, I feel like they're saying like this is our thing. It's like the
yeah,
rest of you get this is our thing. It's like it's so like visceral. It's like it
yeah.
just has no intellectual content.
Exactly. It's only intellectual content, and it's kind of getting a kind of historical model of how the society was. And I have nothing against looking back at times in history and saying that was better. I've nothing against that. It's very frequently objectively true, and there's nothing against like taking particular parts of history, like this law or that custom, or say, oh, things were better before smartphones came out, because like that, all that stuff is objectively true. But like the problem is to have this kind of totality of like life and identity and a nation or whatever back then in the 19th century when England was ruling the waves, Hail Britannia, and let's just bring that back. But it's like that's not an unlocking of the Dasein, of the Dasein. That's just a kind of like again a kind of presumed good, as rational as that good may be, as objective as that good may be, it's still like trying to just kind of take something from the past that at this stage is very distant from us, and that we don't really have a kind of intimate
Yeah,
connection to.
there's that, and there's also this problem. Then these Nietzschean problems of we don't know which way is up and which way is down, as I was alluding to before. Like, are we evolving? Are
So
we
yeah,
devolving? Is everything just indifferent becoming? Is it all, as
yeah,
Zizek sometimes says, of like Kristen Stewartism is like it's kind of arbitrary in a way. It's like, oh, we present this as a progress, but is it really a progress? or somebody in the south of this country flying their southern flag. Is this really would be something good to revive or whatever? But like I
Yeah.
think of this of the I mean, would obviously Trump doesn't want to revive child labor in the coal mine, the children chained to coal mines and go back to that, but still it's like it's all appears more and more arbitrary which direction to take
Yeah, yeah, exactly. So you
from
got
this current horizon sort of.
mm. So like I suppose from Russia's perspective, you have to inoculate yourself against the Western kind of hegemony, but then you have to sort of like unlock the potentiality, the Dasein, however you want to put it, of a certain potentiality, and then you have to kind of let that unfold. But at the same time, that has to be that is a Russian kind of Dasein, so it has to kind of it's going to be framed by particular
Not all
Russian
the time
particularities.
kowtow to what Kant would call the heteronymous forces,
Mm,
the outside forces. Gather more, I guess, as Dugin would put it, more in the inner man
mm,
of the Russian, instead of all the time like somebody in Europe or somebody in Washington is saying something that has to be responded to. They don't want to have to respond to these things
yeah. So
that one has to defend oneself against.
and like that's where it gets difficult because I think that like it's kind of global liberalism, capitalism, and so on. It's really eating away at particular identities. Like it's really eating it away particular cultures and particular identities. So it creates this anxiety of like we want to recreate our identity, we want to hold on to our identity. But then if you're just holding on to your identity, there's a lack of tapping into the potentiality and
Life.
the unfolding of something. And
It
then you're
becomes
not
the
doing
museumification thing in the way.
museumification,
It's a
exactly.
brittle thing, and we're holding on to it, and we don't want to. It's not alive,
Putting the velvet rope around it. No, you can't touch this. You
right?
know. And in that protection, actually distancing themselves from it just as much as everyone else, you know. So,
Yeah, yeah.
um, so you have this really actually a really complicated task of like, you know, defending yourself against the kind of hegemony, but also letting something unfold. It's actually very complicated and very difficult.
Yeah, I feel like that's why I like Dugan because he's thought through these problems that are so complicated better and
Yes.
more than anyone else.
Yeah, for sure, for sure.
I mean, even though I'm not a Russian and I'm not, I'm a Californian, but I still
Mm.
think like it's a great feat.
Because you could sort of apply that to other places, right? I mean, under different terms, but like
I mean,
in
that's what he tries to do is by making this. He tries to show the Dasein of. I think he wrote like 100 books, but they're not like translated or they're not easily available for different what he thinks the essence of different countries are and how they can unlock them.
Mm, yeah, it would
In
be good.
contradistinction to the liberal mono hegemon or dominance.
Yeah, yeah. It would be good to actually have another conversation about this exact thing of like, well, what's after the liberal hegemony? Like, what's the next step? You know, do people unlock some new potentiality? Do they hold on to previous assumed goods and so on and so forth? That would actually be really good. Do you have any? Just been talking for like an hour 20. Do you have any other aspects of Agamben's work?
Uh, no, not in particular. I mean, that's pretty good. I think that's pretty good.